Okay, thank you, Matthew. And thanks for the opportunity of sharing a bit about our work in Costa Rica. That's a picture of Cerro Chirripó. That's the highest peak in Costa Rica, 3,820 meters. Here's my friend Javier, we've been around. The first time I climbed that peak, I was 1985, I was 10 years old. And it was my parents who decided, probably taking a bit of risk, should we go and do that hike with that little kid? Back in that day, there was no park rangers. It's a national park, but there was no park rangers. There was no park installed capacity, an old refuge. But I went, and somehow I made it up there, and that experience generated an enormous connection with the mountains and with my country, with the nature that surrounded it. I think I was the beneficiary of a peace dividend that the country was able to convert into an investment in protected areas. That provided me that experience. And not only that, the generation that was able to do that in the 80s, in the 70s and in the 80s, was a generation that was able to do a turn on the way the country was developing. We had enormous high rates of deforestation. And that came about around the idea of putting together institutional capacity in the country that could consolidate the protected areas and that can start to see how we could keep trees in place and the biodiversity that's there. So the National Institute of Biodiversity was created, Fundecor, the organization elite, was created, and the Ministry of Environment was put into work, and that led to certain results that many of you might have heard, and if not, we can share here. Costa Rica was able to turn its forest coverage from 23%, 25% in the early 80s to 52% in the last account. It's a country, being a small country, having 4% of biodiversity of the world and 0.05% of the land, is an enormous asset for our development. That natural capital has become important within our energy matrix, specifically linked to electricity provision, because it has allowed us to put in place hydro and geothermal energy matrix that has set the tone for the way that model is developing and has reached volumes of almost 100% of renewable energy to source electricity in the country. So in a way, those are the foundations, like it or not, of a green economy scheme. But those results, you have to understand that create a series of enabling conditions for economic scheme of the country to bloom, basically around tourism. Tourism started to catch up in the 1990s because of the protected areas and the way the communities around the protected areas would identify with nature as a result of those efforts. Tourism has grown to become the main source of income of Costa Rica. We receive, the ratio of citizens and tourists is 0.5. So for 2 citizens, we have like about one tourist a year. And it represents a 2 billion industry yearly, which is about 12% of our GDP, and 11% of the direct and indirect labor. So it's important. Of course, it brings other issues. It brings up different schemes in terms of infrastructure and competitiveness. It has generated high cost for life. But again, that turning point took place because of what was done in the 80s. Now, behind all of this, there's a certain series of elements that we tend to ignore. There's like underlying conditions that can give more elements for further processes. The way this model, this approach of changing land use and creating economic benefits was done had an enormous impact through the people, through a bottom-up approach. Fundecor, institution I lead, in the 90s was a think tank and a do tank. How do we think? How do we go and rip the opportunities that the Rio Convention back in the day set up with climate change, and hey, let's sell oxygen. Sell oxygen became, let's fix carbon. That's when the joint implementation efforts took place. When the Corps started to pilot those things through regeneration, reforestation, working with local landowners and telling them, you know what, the forest you're bringing down, you're going to turn it around, and actually you're going to pay for a service for that. What? Yeah. How? Including transaction costs and making sure there was a benefit out of this. This knowledge was mainstream in national policy frameworks. Initially, we were aiming to have Kyoto as a means of funding these processes. Costa Rica did broker with all this information the first negotiation country to country, and probably the last one, because Kyoto never was able to galvanize. And the Norwegian government was able to pay for CTOs, carbon tradable offsets, back in the day. They don't exist anymore. But it was a significant process that allowed Costa Rica to put a system to have that implementation of incentives in private lands linked to the public lands that had been developed through the protected area system. Because the market never bloomed, then we had to go out and look for efforts. How? Yeah, let's go and look to our fuel consumption and put a tax into it. So that's part of our story. But behind that, there's those people. There's these local people in Costa Rica that were able to jump into that and basically live out of this process. It has generated a level of awareness that's very important. The country started to promote environmental education. And as a result, now we have 75% of the country is environmentally aware. That allows us to, in a way, protect environmental issues when we're dealing with politics and governments. And therefore, have institutions like Fundecor work in these cases such that government policies can become state policies over time. Elisinio, the person that you're seeing in this small video, is one of those cases. A person that went out and decided to jump into that proposal that the Costa Rican society was putting into place and protect his forest, receive a payment of environmental services, good enough just to pay the accounts. But he put 2 hectares into reforestation. One of the hectares has helped him pay the education of their daughters, and the other one, he wants to pay the education of his younger son. So that's the way things have evolved. However, it's not enough. Now, 25 years after, we need to make sure that in Costa Rica we don't fall into comfort zones because of what we've done, how we mainstream this in our development model. And we have a challenge, and that challenge is how you go beyond conservation into real, thorough development. We have a very solid conservation agenda, and we have income linked to it. But now it's how do you go and you address a series of themes that we haven't addressed. We've been very good with the green agenda. Now we have to look at the brown agenda, the green agenda, the marine realm, and make this a real green economy case. So you have to build new value propositions. So my generation, who grew up with peace dividend, with the possibility of being in a country that exposes you to nature in a way that's normal, it's part of how we can move on and grow up and set our country's route, has a challenge now to go one step further and to build what we say the Costa Rica 2.0. And that's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to lead in Fundecor. We're trying to see how can really go deep into what's into the landscape approach. How do we go deep and connect the forest, the biodiversity, to the livelihoods, to the development with the local governments? How do we create schemes down on the ground that promote climate resilience with low emission development? That's why we're trying to develop and prototype monitoring and reporting and verification schemes for adaptation. That's how we're trying to complement to our environmental services program transaction schemes for biodiversity. We're basically promoting and trying to see how we can get Costa Rica to be a breathing lab. It has enormous conditions that we can test ideas and models. We're trying to focus on the 30 meters. This is a photo of a drone flight done the day after the hurricane that hit us last year. Why is it important? Not because we just saw how the conditions are. No, it's because we were able to connect communities into getting information that allows us to know which are the more risk-prone areas. And therefore, we were able to orient, with this information, the local emergency committees to know where to deploy resources and have a very good prevention strategy in place. And this video was taken after the storm passed, just to show people in the community through technology, through streaming, that things were coming back to terms. We're starting to map, as I mentioned, to map where the prone areas are through open source data schemes, through phones in which people are starting to understand where do I have these conditions, through the application of technology. This breathing lab proposal has an orientation that goes beyond conservation. It aims to have Costa Rica reap the benefits of its investment over the last 30 years and be competitive worldwide. Why? Because as Switzerland is able to develop a market to transfer knowledge and financial advice, or Singapore in port logistics, how can Costa Rica be competitive in providing knowledge and environmental front? There's 54 countries now under the Paris Agreement that need solutions for the forest. It's not that you can, copy and paste things, but the way you go about it can be transferred and knowledge applied in other processes. This is where now we're getting a lot of schemes in place. We have countries like Morocco sending information about their red proposals, packed through GIS schemes and being analyzed by Costa Ricans, and we're helping them put a PS model back there, or implementing the PS legislation in Paraguay, or having Namibia interested in the institutional arrangements that we have. For this, we are putting together an international initiative, and this means the country of Costa Rica, called the Costa Rica Green Hub, trying to partner with Norway, who helped us 20 years ago, with China, who's promoting South-South cooperation, and identifying where are other countries in which enabling conditions have to be developed and how the South-South cooperation and knowledge sharing scheme can help. So this is a tale of a country that wants to go further up, of a generation that needs to push those conditions to happen, and of a country that sees things globally and wants to engage in the global economy through the investment we've done in nature, because we think this is a valid development model for our future. Thank you very much.